Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of the John Lyons Show. And I'm excited to be joined by University of Michigan professor, historian, and author Scott Ellsworth. He's written 5 books and maybe has another one coming. We'll get into that a little bit later in the show. Scott, really excited to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining me.
Well, I'm thrilled to be on. Thanks for having me.
And I want to start with kind of how you got into the career you're in, because you've written 5 books, you've been a professor, you were a historian for the Smithsonian for a decade. How did you kind of get into being a historian and then up writing these 5 books? We're going to talk about Midnight on the Potomac, but the other 4 as well. You've had a variance of subject matter. So how did you grow from kind of wanting to get into this to now where you are today?
Well, that's a really great question, and one that in some ways I'm not sure if I know exactly how to answer. What I tell young people is you don't need to know what you want to be when you grow up, but don't waste time while you're there. So I've always had a lot of different interests. I was also raised by older parents who were they were both in a way veterans of World War II. I was raised by that generation. So I certainly heard a lot of stories of the past growing up. That was interesting to me. And then, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we had a skeleton in our closet called the Tulsa, now known as the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I heard about that as a kid. And then in my 20s, I wrote my first book about that. But it took a while to sort of figure out, how to write to reach a broader audience and what kind of stories people are interested in.
Yeah, and I found you say don't waste time when you're there. I think especially you being a college professor, you probably see a lot of uncertainty in young people, and it's, do I pursue this? Do I don't pursue this? So there's value to kind of knowing what you like, but also not wasting time and knowing what you don't like, it sounds like from your perspective too.
No, I think so, and especially today. I mean, just because of, all the stories that are out about how difficult it is for young people,
Yeah.
college graduates to find jobs. We've got this AI revolution that's staring us down. But I think the point is to be you don't have to have the answer, but you need to be thinking about things, pushing, trying to grow, expand yourself, and you'll find a way. Almost everybody, their first job isn't their career, it's just their first
Sure.
job, and that you'll find your place along the way.
It's a great point, and I wanna get to you as a writer, because, like I said, you've written 5 books, but you started with that Tulsa Race Riot book, then you got into The Secret Game, which is about a integrated basketball
Right.
game on the 1940s. You've written about climbing the Himalayas, of course, the most recent book, Midnight on the Potomac. So, a variance on the outside to me in subject matter. I mean, how do you land on these subjects and kind of what goes into that process of selecting what you're going to write about?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. I can't remember the writer who said it, but she said that the advice that write just what you know, she said that's the worst advice ever, because if you just write what you know, you'll maybe get one book and a couple short stories and a handful of poems. So, writers have to go out and seek subjects that they aren't naturally a part of. Although in every book that I've written, I've had some connection with their Englander, Stephen King, who said it the best, that amateurs wait for inspiration, the rest of us just go to work. So what you do is you just research, you think about stories, you think, could this be a book? Would this be something that would be interesting to people in the United States in 2026 or whatever it is? And you dig and dig and dig. That second book that I wrote, The Secret Game, that took a long time. That took years to figure out.
Yeah.
Um, I knew I wanted to. I knew that the game of basketball had changed in a radical way between, say, the 1930s and the 1960s. So, before World War II, basketball could be like a chess game. I mean, games were in the 30s and in points. Not much was going on. By the 1960s, when I'm growing up, you've got a more of a fast-paced, acrobatic game. Dunking is happening, and I knew that the coming of African Americans was important, but I also figured out that wasn't really the only thing that was going on. So that took sort of years of doing lots of research on the history of the game, and then thinking, oh, I'll write about this Final Four, I'll write about that. And I kept realizing I had to go back earlier and earlier. And then it was just by pure luck that I discovered that there had been this essentially illegal integrated college basketball game held in a locked gym in North Carolina in 1944 during the height of segregation, where a black college team played a white college team. They played twice, actually. And I thought, once I had that, I knew I had a story. So you just kind of keep pushing and pushing and try to figure out something that'll work.
And for your other books, is it a similar process where you just kind of push and you found a story here, like Midnight on the Potomac? Is that something you always thought, hey, end of the Civil War interests me? Or is that something as you're going along, you're researching, you say, wow, there's more here than maybe a lot of people realize. I want to get into this. I want to write about this.
Well, that book came out kind of through three different streams, relatively briefly. I've been interested in and reading about the Civil War for like 50 years since I was a kid. And so I knew a lot. I knew the general history of the war. I'd helped to write and produce documentaries about the Civil War. So I sort of knew the material. But I have a wonderful editor in New York who said that I like to publish history books that have a resonance with what's going on in the culture today. And the thing that's going on in American life in the past few years has been that we've been more divided as a nation
Yeah.
than we've ever been in my lifetime. And I was just trying to think about, well, when's the last time we were that divided? And of course, I went back to the Civil War era. But the way I sort of got to that story was I have a wonderful literary agent in New York. And at one point he said, Scott, what about writing a true crime book? And I thought that was interesting. And I did a lot of work. I chased a couple stories, but I realized they weren't going to work. And then I thought, well, what was the crime of the century in the United States in the 20th century? And I thought, well, maybe it was the Manson murders or the Lindbergh kidnapping or Emmett Till or something like that. And then I thought, well, what was the crime of the century in the 19th century? And I said, well, that was obviously the murder of
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln. And the Lincoln story, the assassination, it didn't always quite make sense to me. And then the more I dug into it, I found other things that I thought were significant, research done by other people, but it was obscure, publications. And but I realized I didn't want to write a book just about the assassination because the more I'd read, the more I realized how close we really came to losing our country
Yeah.
in that last year of the war. And it took about 2.5 years to figure that book out. But once I figured it out and what it was going to do, I wrote it in a year. It came really quickly.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is just really trying to think, is this going to work? Will this work? I work on these big foam boards and I'll put post-its on it. And well, that could kind of tie into this. That'll segue into that story. So it's really just kind of slugging it out. It's hard. I will tell you that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more that goes into it than people realize on the surface, right? You see a book on the shelf, but as you're talking about 2.5 years to get to the subject matter, a year writing, it's 3.5 year process. And obviously your other books, some were longer than that. So
Yeah.
I think definitely more of a process than maybe, the average person in a bookstore, I go in and get a book, would think that really goes into it. But I think just interesting insight from you, Scott, in just the variety of ways you come to this stuff. So
And
with
let,
that,
let me just
sure.
let me just toss in one thing. So I was very fortunate back in my 20s and 30s. I spent 10 years working at the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian, Washington, D.C. And, that museum is a crossroads of the country. Everybody
Yeah.
comes. People come for different reasons. Women may want to see the first lady's gowns. Guys might be interested in the military stuff, whatever it is. But one thing I learned by that was that the American public is actually really interested in American history. It's just they're not interested in the way that college professors write about it and things like that. And so what you have to do is you have to find a way to write about history where people can identify with characters, they
Yeah.
can root for people, they can root against people, they can sort of see themselves in the story. And this is nothing new. I mean, this is Homer did this, however many thousand years ago. Writers do it all the time, but you want to write something that will engage people and want them to keep turning the page to see what happens next.
That's actually a great segue to Midnight on the Potomac, which I have here with me. Great book. I read it. And the way you wrote that book, Scott, as I read it, it doesn't read like and I love to read history books. It doesn't really read like any other history book that I've read before. I mean, this was really written almost as a novel, but with obviously factual
Right.
information. You kind of alluded to this. Was that something going into the project? You said, I want to write this book in that style, or is it something that as you started writing, it just kind of built itself that way?
No, I think my writing is really built in that direction just over
Yeah.
the years with all the books, and a little bit more so every time. So everything is real that happens. I don't make up stuff. I mean, I will stretch some evidence, here and there, about the weather or something like that, but I'll know what
Yeah.
the weather was and I can assume, well, the rain clouds came in that afternoon or, whatever it is. But no, I very much, study novelists and what they do and their techniques. I mean, they're great at getting people
Yeah.
to into the story. So are mystery writers, science fiction writers, the whole thing. We root for characters in that. So it's very much written in that way. But I also wanted to write a different kind of Civil War book. Look, 90% of Civil War books are all military history. They're about
Yeah.
generals and battles and regiments and ordnance and weapons and all that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I love military history. But then there's another chunk of books about the politics during the Civil War era, then a very thin sliver of books about African Americans, and an even thinner sliver about women. But the reality is that African Americans and women and these other things, these are super important for how the war is going to turn out. So I wanted to write a book that combined both what was happening on the battlefield with what's happening on the home front, what's happening in Washington, D.C., and to put that together in a way that people will want to keep reading. I also wanted to write it in a way that would appeal to readers who normally would never pick up a book about the Civil War in a million years. Here's a little fact is that 2/3 or more of every book purchased or read in the United States is read by women. And the number of male readers has been declining, whereas across the country, there are thousands and thousands of all women book clubs. They'll read lots of novels. They will read self help books. They'll read some history, but it's often focused on women's history. And I wanted to write a book that recognized the importance of women to the Civil War, as well as the importance of African Americans, and write a book that was more accessible to people who really don't know much about the war.
So this book opens, and I think people look at the story of the Civil War as it was a terrible conflict. Lincoln gets assassinated. It's over. Slavery's done. We move on into Reconstruction. And they
Right.
know the basics. But the early parts of this book, you really get the sense things are very precarious for the
Yeah.
Union Army, for the Union in general. I mean, this was something that I think I knew on a surface level, but your book really shows that this could have gone either way as late as 1864 and getting into the final year of the war.
As late as the late summer of 1864. I mean,
Yeah.
the Union Army, they had the largest army ever, assembled in the Western Hemisphere, 120,000 troops under this, brand new commander, Ulysses S. Grant. They're going to do all this. He loses nearly a third of his army in the matter of weeks. A rebel army not only invades the North again, but they invade the District of Columbia. They're within hours of burning down the White House, of burning down the Capitol, perhaps capturing the president. Things were so bad politically for Lincoln that in August of 1864, the kingmaker for the Republican Party, a guy by the name of Thurlow Weed, came to the White House and said, "It's all over. There is no way you're getting reelected. You need to resign. You need to quit. It's all over." So the sense is, people will go to see the wonderful battlefield at Gettysburg. You look at the high water mark of the Confederacy, and it's a sense that, well, after that happened, really everything is a mopping up operation. But it wasn't, not at all. And we
And then
came
there was
very close to having a divided country.
and there were several things in your book that surprised me, and one of them was, as late as the summer of 1864, it's uncertain Lincoln's gonna even win another term, even stand for an election, and it's something I think, again, you look at, okay, he's elected in 1861, he's reelected in 1864, that's that. But reading your book, really, again, it was a couple months difference of him maybe not only not being reelected, maybe not even running for that second term. I just found that really surprising when I read it.
No, absolutely, and he was almost murdered twice in the
Yeah.
summer of 1864. Once when that rebel army had come to the northern tip of the District of Columbia, they stopped. We don't quite know why to this day they did, but Lincoln wants to go out and watch the fighting, and so he goes to a place called Fort Stevens, and rather than get behind a wall, he stands up on top of a parapet. Well, 200 yards away, there are Confederate sharpshooters. They can see a really tall guy with a long black coat and a tall black hat. Well, who are they shooting at?
Yeah.
And of course, bullets are whizzing by right and left. All the officers, Mr. President, you need to get down. He's ignoring them. And it's not until a assistant U.S. Army surgeon standing 3 feet away catches a round in the leg that Lincoln finally gets down. So he's almost shot there. But also that summer, this is something that sort of amazed me, is that we had nothing like we'd have a Secret Service today to
Yeah.
protect the president. He had a bodyguard, but he wasn't always there. But President Lincoln would ride alone at night and during the day across the District of Columbia from the White House to the soldiers' home where the family lived during the hot summer months. And one night that summer, as he's rounding into the gate, the sentries hear a shot go off. Here comes Lincoln, hatless on a horse, tearing into the soldiers' home. They get him inside. Then they go out and they find his hat, and there's a bullet hole right through it, maybe an inch or two above where his head was. I mean, he almost died at that point. So much of history is contingent on just little things working one way or another, and that's really what blew me away. And that took me a while to figure that out and to figure out a way to write about it and to remind people how fragile our country was back then.
Yeah, I mean, essentially a 2-inch difference from him being
Yeah,
assassinated, which is just, and like you said, nothing like the Secret Service today, just an amazing story. And that kind of leads me, Scott, to my next question. Your book talks about there's a lot of plots the Confederacy have behind Union lines. Obviously, you just mentioned the assassination attempt
yeah,
of Lincoln, but there's plots in cities, there's plots involving Canada or agents in Canada.
yeah,
I mean, I just thought they were really fascinating. The one that stood out most, and I'm hoping you can expand on this, the plot to burn down, I believe it was
yeah,
New York City,
yeah.
but because a window wasn't open right or whatnot, it didn't. But they came again, maybe a few inches, maybe a foot away from burning down large parts of New York City.
Absolutely. So the story with all that is by the spring of 1864, the Union has lost all these troops, but so's the Confederacy. And the Confederate leaders realize we can't win our independence on the battlefield. We can't replenish our troops like they
Yeah.
can in the North. We just aren't able to do that. And so but there's no lack of a will to fight. They want their country to be independent. And so they realize we have to find a different way to fight. And what they decide to do is to bring the war home to the civilian population of the North with the idea of moving the needle of public opinion, because now there's this peace movement that started in the North where people are saying, we've lost too many of our husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, lovers. Let's just let the South go. Let's just be done with that. And so what the South does is they bring the war to the North. And the most spectacular effort is when 8 Confederate Secret Service agents leave Montreal. The head of the Confederate Secret
Yeah.
Service has moved to Montreal. He has $500,000. This is 500,000 $1864.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money. He's got a lot of projects. And what he does is he set 8 agents under aliases from Montreal to New York City. They check into 16 different hotels. They also pick up from a pro Southern chemist in Manhattan vials of something called Greek fire, which is the metal sodium that's held suspended in an inert liquid. But when you expose sodium to fire, to the air, it bursts into fire. So they pile up all the furniture and bedding in their hotel rooms. They put oil on it and things like that. They open the Greek fire. The room bursts into flames. but they didn't know one thing, which is they needed to open the windows in their hotel rooms to allow enough oxygen to come in and to really set these off. And because they didn't do that, the hotel authorities were able to put out the flames. But if they had either done it earlier in the year or left those windows open, there's a good chance that much of Manhattan between Madison Square and the Battery would have been burned down, because there were so many fires that the New York Fire Department just simply couldn't have handled that.
Which is amazing, right? So 2 inches from Lincoln being assassinated, and
Yeah,
now some closed
some
windows away.
windows, exactly.
It's just, and it's crazy to me because what we've talked about so far are things that were really surprising when I read the book. But arguably, I think what surprised me the most, Scott, and this is something I really had no clue about before I read, John Wilkes Booth was not some outcast, unknown actor. He was one of, if not the most celebrated actors of his day. I couldn't believe it when I read it.
He was absolutely a superstar, and he was, the Brad Pitt or something of his era. There was just no question about it. He sold out theaters across the country. Hundreds are turned away from his performances. The critics loved him. New York Times, Boston papers, Philadelphia, Chicago. He's a genius. He's a genius, and all this stuff. And the reason we know that is because of the simple fact that, thank goodness, the Civil War has never been the sole property of college professors. And instead, there have been regular citizens, everyday people who become obsessed or very super interested in some aspect of the Civil War, and they'll spend a huge portion of their life researching it. And I discovered this man by the name, deceased now, by the name of Arthur F. Lew. He spent his entire life working in the insurance industry in Pennsylvania, but on evenings and weekends, he decided he would find every single mention of John Wilkes Booth in a newspaper, a letter, a document, anything. And he created this incredible chronology of Booth's life, like 300 pages, everything documented and footnoted. And it was more or less privately published. I got a copy, and I'm reading through this thing, and I'm realizing that Booth wasn't at all the kind of the loser that I had been grown up with, that he
Yeah.
was this second rate actor, living in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother, that he was this sort of volatile, guy, kind of an archetype of a John Hinckley or a Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the superstar. And once I realized that, I said, well, what else did we have wrong about him? And that was really when the book began to work.
So the natural follow-up there, Scott, though, is if he was one of the most famous actors of his day, why has he largely been portrayed as a guy that was an outcast and was unpopular in basically every history outside of this that I've seen of the Civil War?
Absolutely. Well, the reason is something called the Lost Cause. And the Lost Cause was an era in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, roughly 1900 to 1920 or 18, whatever. And this is when the history of the Civil War was entirely rewritten.
Yeah.
And it used to be that that the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis, they were all traitors. It used to be that the war was all about slavery. No, now we're going to change it. Now the Confederate generals, they aren't traitors; they're American heroes. The government gets behind this. A statue of Jefferson Davis appears in the Capitol. There are more statues built of Robert E. Lee than of Ulysses S. Grant. And now the South is something to be, the Confederacy is something to be celebrated. The war is now not about slavery, but it was a unfortunate misunderstanding between white cousins over states' rights and things like that. So to do that, these figures become romantic, but you can't romanticize an assassin.
Yeah.
So what you have to do is you have to say that John Wilkes Booth had nothing whatsoever to do with Confederate war aims whatsoever, and that the war ends at Appomattox, which it didn't. It still went on after that, and that this is sort of a lone wolf, a nut out on his own, has nothing to do with anything else.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting explanation, and I think if not for, essentially one amateur researcher and obviously you finding his work, I think a lot of people wouldn't know about that, and I think it also lends to when you look at the plot, to kill Lincoln. I think a lot of people get, hey, Ford's theater, he gets shot, Booth gets caught a week later in the woods, end of
Right.
story. But as your book shows, I mean, it went a lot deeper than that. Not only were there other people targeted that night, but after the assassination, there's a lot of people along the way, big and small, that play a role in helping Booth survive for as long as he does.
Well, it does, but the real thing was once I realized we had Booth's personality all wrong, that
Yeah,
he wasn't this loser loner guy, but it was this superstar. Then I thought, what else did we have wrong? And then once again, I got lucky. Again, a group of amateurs, a wonderful fellow by the name of James O. Hall, who was an amateur historian, but a legendary one, who found lots of lost documents, misfiled, and all that. And he connected with two former CIA or NSA officers, and they did a book that came out in the 1980s called "Come Retribution," that really details all of the connections that Booth had with the Confederate Secret Service.
yeah,
And once I put that together, that was really the key. Now we don't have a smoking gun. There's no document somewhere that says
yeah,
that the head of the Confederate Secret Service told Booth to murder Lincoln, and there wouldn't be. I mean, intelligence agencies don't leave a lot of paper around.
yeah,
And when it was clear that the Confederacy was going to fall, what happened at the Confederate Capitol is everybody starts to burn all the documents of the government. So there wouldn't be something there, but there's connection after connection that Booth has with members of the Confederate Secret Service. And what I have readers go ahead and read and decide for themselves. But it's clear to me that he didn't think this up on his own, and
yeah.
somebody else gave him the idea, and eventually, ultimately, he was a pawn in someone else's game.
Yeah, and so I guess my last question about the book, Scott, is you go through the assassination, the end of the Civil War, and I feel like this time period, you can call it the, 10 months leading up to Lincoln's assassination or the year leading up, however you
Yeah,
want to parse it. One of the most pivotal moments in American history because not only does it end the Civil War, but I think the course we take with Andrew Johnson as president is quite different than the one we would take as Lincoln. So, just in your words, what's the legacy of not just the end of the Civil War, but the assassination and the road we took versus the road not taken?
yeah. I think there's a few things. So I would tell anybody who wants to read the book, and I hope you do. Um, you're going to read about the big people, about Lincoln and Lee and Grant and Sherman and all of that, but you're also going to read a lot about regular everyday Americans, and these incredible Union volunteers and what they did, about nurses and other women who did things to help the cause. But the story to me was a couple of things. One was that um, you know, the real heroes of this book were everyday loyal American
Yeah,
citizens who were quite different, men and women, black and white, immigrant, native born, all of that, but they were able to join together in the common purpose. They defeated the Confederacy, they destroyed slavery, they preserved the Union, and they gave us a second chance as a nation to do a better job of living up to our founding ideals. And every single one of us stands on their shoulders. One thing I wanted to do with this book as well, and we're in a very uh, dangerous and sort of sad moment in many ways in this country. Not only are we very divided, but we're also very pessimistic. There's not much
yeah.
trust in our institutions. And the fact of the matter is that we have got lots of heroes in our past who sacrificed in ways we cannot even begin to imagine. We all stand on their shoulders. I want us to celebrate them, and I want us to remind everyone that we've faced crises in the past. We've gotten through them as well too, but we're going to have to be tough and determined, and we're going to need to love our country very much to do so. But now's the time to do it. But this will give you, a reminder that this is part of our DNA and it's part of who we are.
And as someone who's read the book, I can attest to the fact that yes, you get the big people, but you also get so many of the ordinary people. And I think their stories, in many ways, are just as interesting and just as pivotal, just not as well known. And Scott, before we let you go here, you've written 5 books. Obviously, you're a University of Michigan professor. Anything else you're working on right now? Any ideas you're formulating you want people to know about?
Oh, I've been sort of all over the map. I've thought of everything kind of from the, the westward movement to
Mm,
lots of different things. I'm sort of right at the moment. I'm actually thinking about writing a book about New York City during the 1970s, particularly during there was a great crisis in 1975 when the city ran out of money. They're firing police officers, they're firing teachers, they're firing fire department. A
mm.
great crisis, garbage strikes, all of this kind of stuff. And it really went to what do we need to do as a society to move ahead? Who gets what? Who pays for it, and all that. But I'm discovering some good stories, so we'll see. What's going on. But we've been in big messes before, and we need to remember that we can get out of them as well.
Yeah, and let's hope those lessons can be followed, as you mentioned before, that it has been bad before, we've moved beyond it before, we can do it again. Scott, absolute pleasure talking to you about this book. As I said, I've read Midnight on the Potomac. It is a great book. I suggest it to everyone, whether you're into the Civil War or not. It's just an interesting American story. Scott, as I said, pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, John. It's a real honor to be on your show. Thank you.
All right, stay tuned for next time. That is Scott Ellsworth, University of Michigan professor and historian. Be on the lookout for his previous works as well as what he's got cooking up next. Thank you.